Hey guys, tonight I'd like to take you on a journey back into one of the most pivotal and haunting chapters of the 20th century. A time when the fate of nations collided in jungles and cities, and when ordinary people were swept into extraordinary events. We're going to explore the Vietnam War in all its layers, the battles fought in steamy rainforests, the quiet strength of villages caught between powerful forces, the young soldiers who arrived from faraway lands, and the families who waited and hoped. We'll talk about how ancient empires shaped this land long before foreign soldiers ever arrived, how politics and ideology divided a country, and how millions of lives were changed forever. It's a story about courage and sorrow, about hopes for freedom, about loyalty and betrayal, and about the echoes of history that still ripple through Vietnam and the world today. Together, we'll uncover how this conflict began, how it grew, and how it finally ended, and how its memory lives on in hearts and nations alike. Before we start, if you're enjoying this kind of storytelling, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a moment to subscribe to my channel and give this video a like. My channel is still quite new, and every bit of support helps me keep sharing these long histories with you. Thank you so much. It truly means the world. Let's begin. Long before the world came to know the name Vietnam as a battleground, it was a land of rivers and mountains, of ancient kingdoms and deep forests. It's a country stretching along the eastern edge of Southeast Asia, its shape slender and curved like the spine of a dragon. From north to south, the land changes its face again and again. Lush mountains cloaked in mist, broad rivers carrying silt to fertile plains, emerald rice paddies glittering beneath the tropical sun. The people who lived here carried centuries of stories in their hearts. Their language flowed with poetic rhythms. Their songs rose like birds in the dawn. Markets bustled with bright silk and fragrant herbs, with vendors selling baskets of star anise, ginger and red chilies. Children played in courtyards under the sway of tall palms, their laughter bright against the hum of cicadas in the afternoon heat. For over 1,000 years, Vietnam lived under the shadow of China. Emperors sent armies across the borders, building fortresses and imposing laws. Yet the Vietnamese never fully surrendered their spirit. Again and again, rebellions flared, like the famous Trung Sisters who, in the 1st century, led armies against Chinese rule, riding elephants into battle with banners streaming in the wind. Vietnamese history is filled with heroes who became legends, warriors who stood against foreign invaders, poets who wove sorrow and hope into verses recited beneath oil lamps. Over the centuries, Vietnam regained its independence, forged its own dynasties, and crafted a culture both fierce and graceful. Then, in the 19th century, new sails appeared on the horizon. Ships flying the tricolor flag of France anchored off the coast. Traders and missionaries came first, speaking of commerce and salvation. But behind them came soldiers and cannons. By the late 1800s, Vietnam had become part of French Indochina, bound into the French colonial empire. Under French rule, Vietnam changed. Grand boulevards were carved through cities like Hanoi and Saigon, lined with stone buildings adorned with balconies and shutters painted the color of cream. Cafes served strong coffee in tiny cups, the air thick with the aroma of roasted beans and Gauloises cigarettes. Yet the countryside remained deeply Vietnamese. Farmers bent over paddies under the searing sun, planting rice seedlings one by one. In small villages, elders gathered in wooden houses, telling old stories, their faces lined by years and wisdom. The French extracted wealth from the land, rubber, rice, coal, and shipped it away to distant markets. Taxes were heavy. Traditional ways of life were disrupted. Many Vietnamese began to dream of freedom. Among them was a young man named Nguyen Sinh Cung, later known to the world as Ho Chi Minh. He was born in 1890 in a village shaded by bamboo groves. His father was a scholar, proud and fiery in spirit, who resisted French authority. As a boy, Ho Chi Minh watched colonial officials treat his people with disdain. He dreamed of a country free from foreign rule. As he grew, he traveled the world, working on ships, living in Paris, London, and even the United States. He swept floors in kitchens, retouched photographs, and read revolutionary newspapers. He saw how colonial empires treated those they ruled, and his determination grew. When World War I ended, Ho Chi Minh tried to petition Western leaders at the Versailles Peace Conference for Vietnamese independence. His request was ignored. Disillusioned but not defeated, he turned toward communist ideas, convinced that communism might help break the chains of colonialism. By the 1940s, Ho Chi Minh was back in Vietnam, hiding in jungles and caves, organizing resistance. The Japanese had driven out the French during World War II, bringing their own brand of harsh rule. But when Japan surrendered in 1945, a brief window opened. In Hanoi, under a bright sky, Ho Chi Minh stood before thousands of people and declared Vietnam's independence. His voice carried through loudspeakers as he read words borrowed from the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. For a moment, hope bloomed like flowers after rain. But the French returned, determined to reclaim their colony. And so began the First Indochina War, a brutal struggle from 1946 to 1954. French troops marched through narrow streets. Viet Minh fighters, led by Ho Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giep, melted into jungles, waging guerrilla warfare. Villages burned under artillery shells, mountains rang with gunfire, rivers turned muddy with silt and ash. The war dragged on. Families fled their homes. Rice paddies lay fallow, their waters reflecting skies streaked with smoke. French soldiers lived in fear of ambush. Viet Minh fighters traveled by night, carrying weapons and rice, driven by the dream of a free nation. Then came the decisive battle at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The French believed they could lure the Viet Minh into open battle and crush them. They built a fortress in a remote valley, surrounded by hills, but the Viet Minh dragged heavy artillery piece by piece through jungle trails, hauling cannons up impossible slopes. They dug miles of trenches, inching closer day by day. The siege was relentless. Shells fell like rain. In May 1954, the French defenses collapsed. Thousands of soldiers surrendered. The world watched in shock. France's colonial ambitions in Indochina lay in ruins. That summer, diplomats gathered in Geneva. Maps were spread on polished wooden tables. Borders were drawn and erased, redrawn and argued over. In the end, Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. The North would be ruled by Ho Chi Minh's communist government. The South would remain under an anti-communist regime, supported by Western allies. Elections were promised in 1956 to reunite the country. But fear and suspicion poisoned any hope of compromise. The elections never happened. Thus, Vietnam stood divided, a fragile line running through rice paddies, rivers, and families. In the South, a leader named Nguyen Ngo Dinh Diem rose to power. A Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country, he was fiercely anti-communist and determined to build a strong South Vietnam. But his rule grew harsh. He jailed opponents, censored newspapers, and demanded loyalty. In villages across the South, whispers spread of resistance. Guerrillas began to organize, men and women who would come to be known as the Viet Cong. They moved by night, striking quickly and vanishing into jungles. Meanwhile, in Washington, American presidents watched events unfold with growing anxiety. The Cold War loomed over every decision. The United States feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, other nations in Southeast Asia would fall like dominoes. So America sent money, weapons, and advisors. American soldiers in green fatigues arrived in South Vietnam, teaching tactics, studying maps, riding in jeeps through dusty roads. But the Viet Cong grew bolder. They set ambushes along highways, attacked government posts, and assassinated local officials. In 1963, South Vietnam erupted in crisis. Buddhist monks protested Diem's repressive policies. In Saigon, a monk named Thich Quang Duc set himself on fire, sitting silently as flames consumed his saffron robes. The photograph of his sacrifice shocked the world, searing itself into the memory of a generation. The crisis in South Vietnam deepened with each passing month. In November of 1963, a coup toppled Ngo Dinh Diem's government. The streets of Saigon crackled with tension as armored vehicles rolled through intersections and soldiers occupied government buildings. Diem and his brother were captured and killed, leaving the South Vietnamese government teetering and leaderless. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy had been wrestling with the growing chaos in Vietnam, debating whether to increase American involvement or seek an exit. But on November 22, 1963, Kennedy himself was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. A stunned world watched as Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath of office aboard Air Force One, his face tight with grief and determination. Vietnam now fell squarely into Johnson's lap. Johnson inherited both Kennedy's advisors and their optimism. Many believed that with enough men and material, the United States could stabilize South Vietnam. American intelligence reported that the Viet Cong were gaining strength. Villages once loyal to the government were slipping into fear and quiet resistance. Then came August 1964, and the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. American naval vessels patrolled off the coast of North Vietnam. Reports came back of attacks by North Vietnamese patrol boats. Whether the second attack ever happened remains debated to this day, but the incident gave President Johnson a crucial political tool. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting the president broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia. The die was cast. Soon, American troops were flowing into Vietnam in ever greater numbers. What had begun as a mission of advisors became a full-fledged military intervention. Helicopters became the signature sound of this new phase of the war. They chopped through humid skies, hovering low over fields of ripening rice and villages dotted with palm trees. Dust swirled around landing zones as soldiers leapt out, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning the tree lines. Young American men arrived in Vietnam with nervous smiles, clutching duffel bags and letters from home. Some were volunteers, filled with ideals of service and duty. Others were draftees, pulled from college dormitories, mechanic shops and farm fields. Vietnam quickly transformed their lives. The heat was thick, pressing down like a damp blanket. Sweat rolled down spines. Fatigue set into bones. Monsoon rains arrived suddenly, soaking uniforms and turning dirt paths into rivers of mud. Patrols slogged through jungles where vines wrapped around ankles and insects buzzed in clouds. Leeches latched onto skin. Every snapped twig made hearts pound. Soldiers walked in silence, scanning the undergrowth for tripwires, punji stakes, and hidden snipers. In some villages, children smiled and waved, offering flowers or candy. In others, villagers watched with guarded eyes, uncertain whether the Americans were protectors or intruders. Ambushes came without warning. A quiet jungle path could explode in bursts of gunfire. Explosions threw dirt and leaves into the air. The acrid smell of gunpowder stung nostrils. After the firefight, soldiers counted their numbers. Medics worked quickly, their hands stained with blood, as helicopters swooped in to lift the wounded away. The thumping blades faded into the distance, carrying men toward hospitals where doctors fought to save lives. At American bases, soldiers cleaned rifles, played cards, and tried to drown out thoughts of what waited outside the wire. Mail call was the highlight of the day. Letters from mothers, sweethearts, wives, and friends were read over and over until the paper grew soft and creased. Dear Johnny, everything seeps fine here. Your father fixed the porch steps. We miss you so much. Stay safe. Love, Mom. Those few words connected two worlds, one of quiet suburban streets and blooming rose bushes, and another of jungles, mud, and fear. In the evenings, the jungle sang its own music. Cicadas shrilled in the trees. Frogs croaked in rice paddies. Far off, artillery thundered like distant drums. Some nights, soldiers huddled in foxholes, their helmets beaded with rain, while flares arched high into the sky, casting eerie white light over swaying palms. Shadows leapt and twisted. Every leaf seemed alive. Other nights were still and quiet, as if the war held its breath. In those moments, some soldiers found themselves staring up at stars piercing the velvet darkness. Thinking of home, they remembered the smell of fresh-cut grass, the taste of cold soda, the rustle of autumn leaves on sidewalks. Meanwhile, in Saigon, life wore two faces. By day, streets bustled with traffic, scooters buzzing like hornets, bicycles weaving through buses and trucks. Market stalls overflowed with dragon fruit, bright oranges, and fragrant herbs. Women in flowing ao-dai dresses glided through crowds, their conical hats shielding them from the sun. American soldiers on leave wandered through markets, bartering for silk scarves, wooden carvings, and lacquered boxes. Bars catered to GIs, neon lights blinking under the tropical night. Bands played rock and roll songs imported from halfway around the world. But even in Saigon, the war was never far away. Bombings shattered the peace of city streets. Buildings bore pockmarks from bullets and shrapnel. People whispered rumors of Viet Cong agents moving unseen among the crowds. By 1966 and 1967, the American presence had swelled into hundreds of thousands of troops. Bases dotted the landscape from coastal cities to jungle highlands. Convoys of trucks rumbled down highways under the watchful eyes of soldiers manning machine guns mounted in turrets. The Viet Cong, however, remained elusive. They knew every trail and river, every hidden tunnel snaking beneath villages and rice fields. American commanders launched search and destroy missions, hoping to flush out the guerrillas, but often found only empty jungle. B-52 bombers roared high above, unseen but felt in the distant trembling of the earth. They dropped thousands of pounds of bombs on suspected enemy positions, leaving vast craters where trees once stood. Yet the enemy seemed to melt away, only to reappear somewhere else. For every victory claimed, another ambush seemed to spring from the shadows. The war became a test, not just of armies, but of will. American generals measured progress in enemy body counts. They spoke of light at the end of the tunnel. Yet to the men on the ground, that tunnel seemed endlessly dark. In the villages, the Vietnamese people struggled to survive. Farmers worked their fields under watchful eyes, caught between two forces demanding loyalty. Some villagers were pressed into service by the Viet Cong at night, then questioned by American patrols by day. For many Vietnamese, there was no simple choice. They wanted peace. They wanted their children to grow up without fear. But the war offered few easy answers. And back in America, the first murmurs of doubt began to grow. News reports showed grim footage: burning villages, wounded soldiers, refugees carrying bundles on their backs. Families began to wonder how long the war would last, and why it was being fought at all. Folk singers wrote haunting ballads. Protesters carried signs demanding peace. Young men burned draft cards in public squares. The nation was beginning to split along deep, painful lines. Meanwhile, the soldiers kept moving through the green labyrinths of Vietnam, each day a tightrope walk between danger and exhaustion. In the coming years, the war would grow larger still, its shadow stretching across oceans. But even in its early days, the seeds were planted for a conflict that would leave scars on two nations and on every soul who passed through its storm. As 1967 turned into 1968, the war seemed to many Americans like an endless echo of the same images: soldiers pushing through tangled green jungles, helicopters rising over red dust, commanders speaking of victories that somehow never felt complete. In villages across Vietnam, life tried to continue beneath the weight of uncertainty. Women carried baskets balanced on bamboo poles across their shoulders, selling fish, fruit, and steaming bowls of pho on busy corners. Children chased each other past shrines draped in colorful cloth, laughter ringing out for brief moments that felt almost normal. But even the simplest moments were tinged with danger. Soldiers searched villages for hidden weapons. Government officials arrived to check for loyalty to the South. Then, under cover of darkness, Viet Cong fighters slipped back into those same villages, speaking quietly of resistance, freedom, and revenge. Vietnam was a country of shifting loyalties, of whispers, and of secrets held close to the heart. The American troops who came to fight there were often young, barely past high school, carrying rifles and photographs of sweethearts folded into their wallets. Many believed they were helping a small country fight for freedom. Others were simply trying to survive their year-long tour and go home in one piece. Yet each day tested them in ways few had ever imagined. They learned to walk in silence, listening for the almost inaudible click of a booby trap hidden beneath leaves. They learned how the jungle smelled before rain, a scent of wet earth and crushed green plants, and how monsoon showers could drown out even the sounds of gunfire. At night, many lay awake, staring at stars through gaps in the jungle canopy, thinking of home. The war seemed a dream then, unreal, as if they might wake up and find themselves back on familiar streets, surrounded by the hum of cars and the glow of neon lights. But morning always came, and with it another patrol, another mission, another chance to disappear into the shadows of Vietnam's forests and hills. It was in this uneasy calm that 1968 arrived, bringing the Tet holiday. Tet was the most sacred time in Vietnam, a celebration of the Lunar New Year, ancestors, of family gatherings and prayers for good fortune. Traditionally, a ceasefire was observed during Tet. Soldiers on both sides expected a brief, precious reprieve. But as the first days of the new year dawned, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese launched a massive coordinated assault across South Vietnam, an offensive that would change the course of the war and the world's perception of it. Cities and towns erupted in gunfire and explosions. In Saigon, Viet Cong fighters stormed the grounds of the U.S. Embassy, engaging American Marines in fierce gun battles among palm trees and embassy walls. Television cameras captured the chaos, broadcasting images back to the United States almost in real time. The Tet Offensive was eventually beaten back. American and South Vietnamese forces regained control of the cities and inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers. From a purely military perspective, it was a defeat for the Viet Cong. But the psychological impact was profound. Americans watching the news saw fighting raging in places they'd been told were secure. They saw that the enemy could strike anywhere, at any time. Doubts grew deeper. Confidence in government reports of progress began to crumble. In February 1968, American journalist Walter Cronkite, the trusted voice of the evening news, traveled to Vietnam. After reporting from the front lines, he told viewers that the war would end in stalemate, that victory was unlikely. For millions of Americans, it felt like a turning point. President Lyndon B. Johnson, weary and burdened, announced in March that he would not seek re-election. His face, once animated and full of Texan vigor, seemed drawn, etched by the weight of decisions that had sent so many young men to war. Meanwhile, for soldiers still in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive meant more months of uncertainty, more missions into hostile terrain, more friends lost to sudden violence. Villages were destroyed and rebuilt, only to be destroyed again. Refugees streamed down roads, carrying bundles tied with string, leading children whose eyes were wide with confusion and fear. In the jungles, the Viet Cong continued to fight. They vanished into tunnels hidden beneath bamboo groves. They moved along narrow paths through the mountains, carrying supplies and weapons on bicycles modified to carry enormous loads. The Ho Chi Minh Trail became legendary, a network of hidden routes, snaking through the mountains of Laos and Cambodia, feeding the war effort in the south. American planes bombed the trails day after day, but the paths always reopened, like veins repairing themselves in a living body. The American soldiers who fought in Vietnam tried to adapt. Some became hard and wary, suspicious of every villager, every child. Others held on to small acts of kindness, giving candy to children, sharing water with a farmer whose field lay scorched and ruined. Yet even kindness felt dangerous. Viet Cong fighters sometimes used villages as cover, blending in as farmers and shopkeepers. An American soldier might chat with a friendly merchant in the morning, only to face a sniper's bullet from that same village at dusk. Back in America, 1968 was a year of turmoil. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April. Cities erupted in flames and protests. In June, Senator Robert F. Kennedy was shot in California, just after winning the Democratic primary. The streets were filled with protesters carrying signs demanding an end to the war. College campuses became battlegrounds of words and ideas. Music grew louder, angrier. Folk songs turned into rock anthems. Long hair and peace symbols became emblems of resistance. Families gathered around dinner tables and argued. Fathers and sons shouted over politics. Mothers wept silently into dish towels. The war was no longer half a world away. It was inside every American living room, carried on flickering TV screens, echoing in songs on the radio, stamped into the minds of a generation. Yet amid all the anger, the war kept grinding on. In the thick jungles and highlands of Vietnam, soldiers continued their daily rituals of survival. Patrols pushed deeper into valleys, where mist clung to the trees, and the scent of damp earth rose like a living thing. Some days were filled with the silence of wary movement, broken only by the chirring of insects or the faint rustle of leaves as a monkey swung from branch to branch. Other days erupted into violence without warning. A sudden blast, the sharp crack of rifle fire, shouts echoing through the undergrowth. It was a war, where territory changed hands repeatedly, where hills and villages were won, lost, and won again. Each victory was measured in lives, each map updated with arrows and colored zones that rarely stayed the same for long. For the Vietnamese villagers, daily life continued under a veil of constant fear. In the markets, women bargained over vegetables, while glancing over their shoulders for soldiers or plainclothes agents. Children chased dogs through narrow alleys, but their laughter stopped the moment strangers approached. Many families tried to remain neutral, doing what they could to avoid drawing attention from either side, but neutrality was nearly impossible. At night, the Viet Cong might arrive, seeking food, information, or recruits. The next day, government soldiers or American patrols would come through, searching for weapons, demanding loyalty, and always, behind it all, was the fear of sudden violence. In some villages, elders tried to preserve old traditions, arranging Tet festivals, lighting incense for ancestors, teaching children poetry and songs. Yet festivals were smaller, quieter, haunted by the knowledge that a single shell or sniper's bullet could shatter the fragile moment. Back at American bases, new soldiers arrived almost every week. Wide-eyed and nervous, they stepped off helicopters or transport planes, clutching rifles that still smelled of factory oil. Veterans eyed them silently, measuring how quickly they would learn the jungle's harsh lessons. Some soldiers adapted fast. They learned to read the subtle language of the landscape, the way birds might suddenly fall silent, the rustle of grass betraying hidden movement, the faint impression of footprints in a muddy path. Others struggled. They were stunned by the heat, the insects, the impossibility of telling friend from enemy. Some became quiet, withdrawn, moving like shadows through each day. Commanders planned operations with names like Junction City, Cedar Falls, Rolling Thunder. Briefings were delivered in air-conditioned tents, where officers pointed to maps covered in colored pins. Yet the reality outside those tents was chaos. Villages burned in operations meant to root out enemy fighters. Families became refugees overnight, carrying bundles tied with rope, their faces streaked with dust and tears, roads filled with ox carts, bicycles, and weary men and women walking toward nowhere in particular, just away. American soldiers carried photographs of families back home, smiling parents standing beside cars, girlfriends in prom dresses, children clutching Christmas presents. In quiet moments, they took these photos from helmet liners, staring at them as though trying to summon the world they'd left behind. One soldier wrote in a letter, "Nah, I keep thinking about how you make meatloaf on Sundays, about sitting at the table and Dad saying grace. It seems like another lifetime. Here, it sits just heat and mud and the noise of helicopters. I just want to come home." Letters like his traveled home across oceans and continents, folded into envelopes marked free mail, arriving in small American towns where mothers waited anxiously by the mailbox. Meanwhile, in Saigon, the city's rhythm never entirely stopped. Street vendors cried out the prices of roasted chestnuts and sweet cakes. Cyclo drivers peddled tourists past colonial-era architecture. Temples glowed with flickering candles. Yet even amid the glow, people moved quickly, scanning crowds for danger. Bombing struck restaurants, hotels, and markets. Windows shattered in sudden bursts of noise. Sirens wailed as ambulances raced through narrow streets. The war refused to remain confined to distant jungles. It crept into urban doorways and crowded thoroughfares. American troops on leave tried to forget the jungle for a few hours. They sat in dim bars, drinking beer while jukeboxes played Elvis, the Supremes, and the Doors. Sometimes they danced with local women, who smiled softly but kept watchful eyes. Deals were struck in whispers: silk shirts, fake Rolex watches, carved wooden Buddhas, anything to carry home as proof they'd been to Vietnam. But even laughter in bars was haunted by rumors of spies, of Viet Cong agents slipping unnoticed through the neon glare. As 1968 bled into 1969, the United States faced growing turmoil at home. Protests expanded, becoming massive waves of humanity that filled city streets from coast to coast. College students shouted chants, while police stood with shields and nightsticks. Tear gas rolled like fog across campus lawns. Parents watched television and wondered how it had come to this: sons fighting overseas, daughters marching in protest at home. The country felt fractured, caught in an argument it couldn't escape. And through it all, Vietnam burned on. In the highlands, battles raged over places like Dak II and Hamburger Hill. American paratroopers charged up slopes slippery with red mud, faces streaked with sweat and grime, bodies weighted down with gear. They fought hand-to-hand in trenches and bunkers, gaining ground foot by bloody foot, only to abandon the hills days later, because strategic priorities shifted. The phrase Hamburger Hill came to symbolize the meat grinder quality of the war, a place where men fought fiercely, only to see the ground given up once the battle was won. Soldiers questioned why they were ordered to die for terrain that held no lasting value. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese kept up pressure across the countryside. They built hidden hospitals and caves, stored weapons in secret caches, and carried out ambushes that made the American soldiers feel as though they were fighting ghosts. Even the air itself became dangerous. American planes sprayed defoliants like Agent Orange, stripping leaves from trees to expose enemy positions. The chemical left behind barren landscapes and illnesses that would haunt veterans and civilians alike for generations. Yet life refused to surrender. Villagers replanted rice paddies, even in fields scarred by craters. Children learned to read and write under the watchful eyes of teachers who sometimes taught both patriotism and caution. Markets reopened after battles subsided, selling fresh fish, ripe mangoes, and woven baskets. In temples hidden amid banyan trees, monks struck bells that echoed like heartbeats through the humid air. Families gathered to light incense for ancestors, offering bowls of fruit and fragrant cups of tea. Vietnam remained, above all else, a land of resilience. As the decade edged toward its close, both America and Vietnam found themselves trapped in a cycle neither seemed able to escape. New strategies were debated in the halls of power. Generals and politicians spoke of turning points, of light at the end of the tunnel. Yet, in the jungles and villages, soldiers continued to patrol, villagers continued to rebuild, and families on both sides of the ocean continued to pray for the safe return of those they loved. The war that had begun as a fight against colonial rule had become a conflict entangling superpowers, ideologies, and the hearts of millions. The lines between friend and enemy blurred. The reasons for fighting grew as tangled as the vines choking the jungle paths. But history was still moving forward. New leaders would rise. Peace talks would open and stall, and the war would begin to shift, taking new forms, leaving new scars. And so, as one year gave way to another, the story of Vietnam marched on, deeper into a time of change, of fragile hopes, and of wounds still waiting to heal. In early 1969, change swept across the corridors of power. President Richard Nixon entered office in the United States, promising a new direction for the war. His voice was calm, measured, his words chosen carefully as he spoke of bringing peace with honor. For Americans weary of the endless casualty reports, Nixon's words offered a fragile hope. Yet behind the scenes, the war ground on. A new strategy began to take shape: Vietnamization. The idea was to transfer the burden of fighting to the South Vietnamese army, while steadily withdrawing American troops. The hope was that South Vietnam could defend itself, preserving a non-communist state without endless American sacrifice. In speeches, Nixon spoke confidently of progress, but in reality, Vietnam remained a labyrinth of conflicting realities. Even as plans were drawn up to reduce American forces, secret operations continued. American bombers struck deep into Cambodia and Laos, trying to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that hidden lifeline of the communist forces. The air above Southeast Asia roared with the engines of fighter jets and bombers. The sky streaked with contrails as aircraft released their deadly cargo. Villages disappeared under mushrooming clouds of dust and flame. On the ground, soldiers continued to march into jungles, where every tree might conceal a sniper, every path might hide a booby trap. New units rotated in as older ones went home. Young men who'd been children when the war began now stepped into the humid heat of Vietnam, rifles slung over shoulders, eyes wide with uncertainty. They carried photographs in wallets, sweethearts posing in graduation gowns, family dogs sitting beside Christmas trees, baby sisters in frilly dresses. They tried to memorize the names of their squad mates, because those names could one day be carved into black granite. Meanwhile, back home, America was coming apart at the seams. In 1969, the Vietnam moratorium saw millions of Americans gather in parks and streets, lighting candles and singing songs of peace. In Washington, D.C., rivers of protesters flowed past the White House, carrying signs that read, "End the war now and bring them home." Yet, not everyone agreed. Some Americans believed the war must continue, convinced communism would spread like a stain across Asia if South Vietnam fell. Arguments broke out in barbershops, at family dinner tables, and in churches. The nation was fracturing into pieces. In Vietnam, the war kept shifting like a restless wind. By 1970, Cambodia was pulled violently into the conflict. Nixon authorized American troops to cross the border in a bid to destroy communist sanctuaries hidden just beyond Vietnam's edge. Columns of tanks and soldiers pushed through dense jungles. Bombs fell from the sky. Cambodia, once a kingdom of temples and quiet rice fields, became a new battlefield. The American home front exploded in outrage. Campuses from coast to coast erupted in protests. At Kent State University in Ohio, National Guard troops opened fire on students, killing 4 and wounding 9. The shock rippled across the nation. Parents wept. Students stood silent, candles flickering in trembling hands. The question burned hotter than ever. How much more blood would Vietnam demand? Meanwhile, soldiers in Vietnam felt the distance grow between themselves and home. Letters from friends spoke of protests, of changing music, of new fashions and new slang. Soldiers sometimes felt they were missing an entire world back home, a world that no longer seemed to understand them. And yet the war's realities remained as relentless as the rain. In the highlands of Vietnam, American units set up fire bases atop hills surrounded by jungle. The bases bristled with artillery, sandbags stacked in thick walls, machine guns scanning the tree lines. At night, flares drifted down under parachutes, casting stark white light that flickered over tangled trees and mud. Soldiers manned their posts, eyes darting at shadows dancing beyond the wire. Sometimes the jungle was silent, save for the sigh of wind and the distant calls of geckos. Other nights exploded into chaos as mortars whistled overhead, crashing into red bursts of fire and dust. Young Americans, born in small towns with names like Dover, Little Rock, Spokane, found themselves crouched in foxholes half a world away. They held rifles slick with sweat, breathing through pounding fear, trying to remember the faces of people they loved. In the South Vietnamese countryside, villages struggled under shifting tides of control. One week, government troops occupied a hamlet, erecting fences of barbed wire. The next, the Viet Cong slipped back in, holding meetings under palm fronds, distributing pamphlets, speaking of revolution. In these villages, elders tried to maintain ancient rituals. They held festivals where musicians played two-stringed on gayust under lantern light. Women arranged offerings at altars, bowls of steamed rice, sweet fruits, tiny cups of rice wine. Yet even ceremonies were haunted by fear. Parents hushed children when strangers approached. Farmers hid tools, unsure who would demand taxes or loyalty next. For many Vietnamese civilians, survival meant walking a knife's edge. Help the government, and you risked retribution from the communists. Help the communists, and government troops might come in with rifles and questions. Meanwhile, in American bases, soldiers coped in countless ways. Some immersed themselves in routine, cleaning weapons until the metal gleamed, stacking crates of ammunition, keeping busy to hold the darkness at bay. Others traded stories and jokes, laughter echoing against sandbag walls. if only for a few precious moments. Music drifted through camp loudspeakers, songs by the Doors, Jimi Hendrix, The Temptations. Even amid the mud and heat, a soldier might close his eyes and for a few seconds remember how it felt to cruise down American streets in a Chevy with the radio blasting. Some soldiers collected souvenirs, North Vietnamese propaganda leaflets, enemy flags, wooden carvings from village markets. They wanted proof to show friends back home that they'd been there, that the war was real. Yet nothing felt truly real. The world seemed to exist in two places at once, a jungle of green shadows and the distant promise of home. At night, soldiers lay awake on cots, mosquito nets drifting gently around them. They smoked cigarettes, staring into the dark, counting days left on their short timer calendars. A sergeant might scratch a mark each morning. 23 days and a wake-up. Each day erased brought them closer to the flight home. But some secretly feared they'd never leave. Elsewhere, American commanders struggled to measure progress in a war without front lines. They spoke of enemy body counts, of kill ratios, of villages pacified, but the Viet Cong seemed to vanish and reappear at will. The jungle swallowed soldiers, helicopters, entire battalions. Vietnam was proving itself a place where sheer power couldn't guarantee victory. Meanwhile, the Ho Chi Minh Trail continued to pulse with life. Hidden under dense jungle canopy, the trail carried weapons, rice, medicine, and soldiers southward. American bombers flew mission after mission to sever these routes. Explosions shook valleys, flames licked treetops, yet the trail survived, rebuilt again and again by men and women carrying supplies on their backs, guiding bicycles laden with crates of ammunition through mountain passes under cover of darkness. For the fighters of the North, the journey along the trail was grueling. They marched for weeks through rain and leech-infested rivers, carrying packs so heavy their shoulders bled. They slept in hammocks slung between trees, wrapped in ponchos against the cold. They dreamed of reaching the South, of reuniting the country, of ending foreign presence on Vietnamese soil. But the price was staggering. The jungles of Laos and Cambodia became graveyards for thousands who would never see home again. In Saigon, life existed in a surreal duality. Streets bustled with cyclo-drivers calling out fares, vendors selling rice noodles steaming in fragrant broth, children flying paper kites above tiled rooftops. But behind the laughter and commerce was a city always braced for the next explosion. Bombs struck cafes and theaters. Security checkpoints dotted busy intersections. Saigon was a place where American soldiers might sit sipping Coca-Cola while blocks away, Viet Cong agents planned their next attack. Journalists roamed Saigon's streets, notebooks tucked into shirt pockets, cameras slung over shoulders. They filed reports that shaped how the world saw the war. Some spoke of progress. Others hinted at futility, at a conflict with no clear end. In the highlands of Vietnam, American units set up fire bases atop hills surrounded by jungle. The bases bristled with artillery, sandbags stacked in thick walls, machine guns scanning the tree lines. At night, flares drifted down under parachutes, casting stark white light that flickered over tangled trees and mud. Soldiers manned their posts, eyes darting at shadows dancing beyond the wire. Sometimes the jungle was silent, save for the sigh of wind and the distant calls of geckos. Other nights exploded into chaos as mortars whistled overhead, crashing into red bursts of fire and dust. Young Americans, born in small towns with names like Dover, Little Rock, Spokane, found themselves crouched in foxholes half a world away. They held rifles slick with sweat, breathing through pounding fear, trying to remember the faces of people they loved. In the South Vietnamese countryside, villages struggled under shifting tides of control. One week, Government troops occupied a hamlet, erecting fences of barbed wire. The next, the Viet Cong slipped back in, holding meetings under palm fronds, distributing pamphlets, speaking of revolution. In these villages, elders tried to maintain ancient rituals. They held festivals where musicians played two-stringed an myust under lantern light. Women arranged offerings at altars, bowls of steamed rice, sweet fruits, tiny cups of rice wine. Yet even ceremonies were haunted by fear. Parents hushed children when strangers approached. Farmers hid tools, unsure who would demand taxes or loyalty next. For many Vietnamese civilians, survival meant walking a knife's edge. Help the government, and you risked retribution from the communists. Help the communists, and government troops might come in with rifles and questions. Meanwhile, in American bases, soldiers coped in countless ways. Some immersed themselves in routine, cleaning weapons until the metal gleamed, stacking crates of ammunition, keeping busy to hold the darkness at bay. Others traded stories and jokes, laughter echoing against sandbag walls, if only for a few precious moments. Music drifted through camp loudspeakers, songs by the Doors, Jimi Hendrix, The Temptations. Even amid the mud and heat, a soldier might close his eyes and for a few seconds remember how it felt to cruise down American streets in a Chevy with the radio blasting. Some soldiers collected souvenirs, North Vietnamese propaganda leaflets, enemy flags, wooden carvings from village markets. They wanted proof to show friends back home that they'd been there, that the war was real. Yet nothing felt truly real. The world seemed to exist in two places at once, a jungle of green shadows and the distant promise of home. At night, soldiers lay awake on cots, mosquito nets drifting gently around them. They smoked cigarettes, staring into the dark, counting days left on their short timer calendars. A sergeant might scratch a mark each morning, 23 days and a wake-up. Each day erased brought them closer to the flight home. But some secretly feared they'd never leave. Elsewhere, American commanders struggled to measure progress in a war without front lines. They spoke of enemy body counts, of kill ratios, of villages pacified, but the Viet Cong seemed to vanish and reappear at will. The jungle swallowed soldiers, helicopters, entire battalions. Vietnam was proving itself a place where sheer power couldn't guarantee victory. Meanwhile, the Ho Chi Minh Trail continued to pulse with life. Hidden under dense jungle canopy, the trail carried weapons, rice, medicine, and soldiers southward. American bombers flew mission after mission to sever these routes. Explosions shook valleys, flames licked treetops, yet the trail survived, rebuilt again and again by men and women carrying supplies on their backs, guiding bicycles laden with crates of ammunition through mountain passes under cover of darkness. For the fighters of the North, the journey along the trail was grueling. They marched for weeks through rain and leech-infested rivers, carrying packs so heavy their shoulders bled. They slept in hammocks slung between trees, wrapped in ponchos against the cold. They dreamed of reaching the South, of reuniting the country, of ending foreign presence on Vietnamese soil. But the price was staggering. The jungles of Laos and Cambodia became graveyards for thousands who would never see home again. In Saigon, life existed in a surreal duality. Streets bustled with cyclo drivers calling out fares, vendors selling rice noodles steaming in fragrant broth, children flying paper kites above tiled rooftops. But behind the laughter and commerce was a city always braced for the next explosion. Bombs struck cafes and theaters. Security checkpoints dotted busy intersections. Saigon was a place where American soldiers might sit sipping Coca-Cola, while blocks away, Viet Cong agents planned their next attack. Journalists roamed Saigon's streets, notebooks tucked into shirt pockets, cameras slung over shoulders. They filed reports that shaped how the world saw the war. Some spoke of progress, others hinted at futility, at a conflict with no clear end. By late 1970, American soldiers began rotating home in increasing numbers. Flights departed air bases carrying weary men who stared out windows at jungles, slipping away beneath silver wings. Some tried to smile, gripping orders stamped with the words, "Us." Date estimated return from overseas. Others sat silent, haunted by what they'd seen and left behind. Yet even as American boots began lifting off Vietnamese soil, the fighting did not slow. The South Vietnamese Army, known as RVN, faced new tests. American officers trained them in tactics, supplied them with modern weapons, and urged them to take the lead. Some RVN units fought bravely, enduring grueling battles with heavy losses. They defended remote outposts, launched counteroffensives, and tried to keep villages from falling under Viet Cong influence. But other units were plagued by desertions, corruption, and lack of training. Supplies vanished into black markets. Commanders sometimes misreported victories to please their American advisors. Morale often hung by a thread. Meanwhile, in the jungles, the Viet Cong adapted again and again. They shifted tactics, struck quickly, and retreated into hidden tunnels. They left behind fields seeded with booby traps and villages caught in impossible choices. American intelligence struggled to keep up. Reports flooded in from informants, pilots, and soldiers in the field. Names of villages, rivers, and mountains blurred into an endless tide of coordinates and coded signals. Commanders tried to understand a war without clear lines. They marked maps with colored pins, tracing arrows over terrain so dense it swallowed entire regiments. Yet the jungle held its secrets. In distant Washington, President Nixon faced pressure on all sides. He sought a path out of the war, while trying to avoid the image of abandoning an ally. Peace negotiations began in Paris, shrouded in secrecy. Talks dragged on month after month, each side maneuvering for advantage. Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, flew to Paris for meetings with Le Duc Tho, the North Vietnamese diplomat. They debated ceasefires, prisoner exchanges, political futures, but behind every sentence lay years of bloodshed and suspicion. While diplomats argued in chandeliers' glow, the jungles of Vietnam continued to roar with gunfire. In 1971, South Vietnamese forces, supported by American air power, launched an incursion into Laos. The goal was to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail once and for all. The operation, called Lam Son 719, began with optimism. Columns of tanks rolled across the border. Helicopters ferried troops into enemy territory. Explosions lit the forest canopy, but fierce North Vietnamese resistance quickly turned the operation into chaos. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, tearing helicopters apart. Jungle roads turned into killing zones as ambushes trapped convoys. RVN soldiers fled in panic, leaving vehicles burning on narrow trails. Helicopter pilots flew desperate rescue missions under sheets of machine gun fire. Bodies were loaded into aircraft until blood streaked the floors. Lam Son 719 ended in bitter failure. American commanders reassured Washington it was merely a setback, but behind closed doors, doubts deepened about whether South Vietnam could stand alone. Meanwhile, American soldiers continued to rotate home. Some returned to parades and welcome banners. Others faced cold stares and whispered accusations. A man who had once led patrols through dripping jungles might step off a plane in San Francisco, where protesters waved signs reading "Baby Killers Go Home." Confusion and pain twisted in his chest. He wanted only to forget, but the war would not stay behind him. In quiet moments, He heard the jungle in his dreams, the calls of unseen birds, the snap of a branch underfoot, the scream of a mortar round falling from the sky. In Vietnam, life fought to go on. Villagers rebuilt bamboo houses flattened by artillery, markets reopened, selling chilies, star anise, and woven baskets. Children played soccer on fields marked with faded white lines. Yet even laughter felt fragile. A road once safe might hide a mine. A visitor might be a spy. News of distant peace talks meant little to farmers trying to coax crops from bomb-scarred soil. In Saigon, neon signs buzzed above busy intersections. American soldiers strolled streets lined with tailor shops and photo studios, offering to develop rolls of film for pennies. Young Vietnamese girls sold bouquets of jasmine, their faces unreadable. Bars were filled with music, cigarette smoke curling toward fans overhead. Soldiers toasted absent friends and spoke in hushed voices of the short timer calendar counting down to freedom. Yet for some, freedom felt complicated. How could they return to college dorms, to quiet streets, after living through days of mud, fear, and sudden death? They worried about jobs, about girlfriends who had stopped writing, about nightmares that came in waves without warning. Some veterans turned to writing, pouring memories onto paper. Others buried the past in silence. Families learned to recognize the faraway look in a loved one's eyes when certain words or sounds pulled them back across the ocean. By 1972, the war entered another bloody chapter. The North Vietnamese launched a massive offensive across the demilitarized zone, the Easter Offensive. Tanks rumbled southward in columns, their metal tracks grinding over red clay roads. Artillery rained down on cities and outposts. Villages emptied as terrified families fled, carrying bundles tied with rope, babies clutched tightly to chests. Battles raged from the highlands to the Mekong Delta. Hue, Quang Tri, Kontum, names that became markers on maps and in memories. South Vietnamese troops fought desperately. American advisors radioed for air support. Fighter jets screamed overhead, dropping bombs that turned the jungle into pillars of fire and dust. In Hanoi, the North Vietnamese leadership gambled everything on breaking the South's will. Yet the offensive, while devastating, ultimately stalled. American air power pounded advancing forces. Cities held out longer than expected. President Nixon ordered Operation Linebacker, relentless bombing raids deep into North Vietnam. Bridges crumbled under waves of explosives. Rail lines twisted like ribbons of black metal. Fuel depots erupted in towering orange flames. The images were stark. Civilians fled burning neighborhoods. Fires reflected in rivers choked with debris. Yet amid the devastation, Hanoi refused to bend. Radio broadcasts declared defiance. Propaganda posters showed brave soldiers smiling beneath rising red flags. Back in America, protests continued. In cities across the country, people marched with candles, sang songs, and chanted demands to bring the troops home. Yet Nixon pressed forward with his strategy. He believed that massive bombing might force North Vietnam to negotiate seriously. The American public, exhausted and divided, watched grimly as reports poured in of renewed bombing. Mounting casualties and prisoners of war still held far away. By December 1972, negotiations seemed close to success, but talks broke down once again. In frustration, Nixon ordered the most intense bombing campaign of the entire war, the Christmas bombings, or Operation Linebacker 2. For 11 days, waves of B-52 bombers roared over Hanoi and Haiphong, dropping thousands of tons of bombs. The ground shuddered as entire neighborhoods vanished into smoke and rubble. Hospitals, factories, homes, all were struck. The world reacted with shock and condemnation. Newspaper headlines screamed of destruction. Governments around the world called for an immediate halt. Finally, on January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The terms were complex and fragile. The United States would withdraw all remaining combat forces. Prisoners of war would be exchanged. Both North and South Vietnam agreed to respect the existing dividing line. Yet the reality on the ground was far from settled. American troops began leaving swiftly. Helicopters ferried equipment to waiting ships. Planes taxied down runways carrying soldiers bound for home. The once bustling American bases began emptying out. For some soldiers, departure was surreal. One day they were patrolling jungles and villages. The next they stood on airfields with duffel bags, staring at departing planes. The journey home felt like stepping through a doorway between worlds. Men who had lived in fear of mines, ambushes, and mortar fire suddenly found themselves seated beside businessmen in suits on trans-Pacific flights. Stewardesses offered coffee and peanuts, while distant memories flickered like silent films behind tired eyes. Landing in America brought its own challenges. Some soldiers were greeted with hugs and cheers, banners reading "Welcome Home." Others slipped quietly into airports, unsure how to speak of what they'd seen. Some arrived to find relationships ended, jobs gone, or communities divided by anger over the war. Meanwhile, the people of South Vietnam were left to face an uncertain future. In Saigon, leaders tried to reassure citizens that peace would hold. Government troops patrolled city streets, their uniforms crisp and rifles gleaming. Newscasters spoke of reconstruction and hope. But beneath the surface, fear ran deep. People whispered that the North would not rest until the entire country was unified. Rumors spread of communist advances, of fresh offensives, massing in the shadows. Villagers in the countryside wondered whether American promises would mean anything now that the soldiers were gone. Rice paddies shimmered under the sun, but beneath the surface lay hidden mines and memories of violence. North Vietnamese leaders, for their part, viewed the accords as a means to achieve final victory. They withdrew some forces, but kept supply lines open and plans in motion. The fragile peace became a pause between storms. In the early months of 1973, American troops continued their withdrawal. Helicopters lifted off dusty runways, carrying soldiers who gazed down one last time at jungles that had become both a prison and a proving ground. The skies over Vietnam grew quieter. The roar of jets diminished. Artillery fell silent along many parts of the front, yet no one truly believed the war was over. In small villages, life returned cautiously. Farmers dipped their feet into rice paddies once more, planting seedlings under a blazing sun. Children played in narrow alleys, laughter echoing off walls still pockmarked by shrapnel, but scars ran deep. Many villagers were missing sons, husbands, or fathers who would never come home. In Saigon, optimism battled unease. Government officials gave speeches about rebuilding the nation, about turning away from war toward a future of peace and prosperity. Streets bustled with traffic. Vendors sold bowls of steaming soup, baskets of ripe mangoes, and newspapers whose headlines promised stability. Yet behind smiles lurked anxiety. People saved money, gathered documents, whispered about escape routes. Families quietly discussed whether to flee if the North advanced again. Meanwhile, in North Vietnam, leaders met in high rooms filled with the scent of cigarette smoke and ink. Maps were spread out under harsh lamps. Plans were laid for the final phase of a struggle that had lasted for decades. They believed that time was on their side. Throughout 1973 and 1974, clashes continued despite official peace. Small battles erupted across provinces. Villages changed hands. Refugees streamed down highways, carrying bundles, pushing bicycles loaded with children and blankets. The South Vietnamese army fought bravely in many places. Soldiers defended towns, patrolled roads, and tried to hold back the tide. But without American air support, and amid shortages of fuel and ammunition, cracks widened. American military aid dwindled as Congress grew, unwilling to spend more on a distant war. The American public, exhausted and divided, focused on scandals at home. The Watergate affair consumed President Nixon's presidency. Nightly news broadcasts shifted from jungle firefights to hearings and secret tapes. In the spring of 1975, the North Vietnamese launched their final offensive. It began far in the Central Highlands, where North Vietnamese tanks rolled through mountain passes. Town after town fell in rapid succession. South Vietnamese troops tried to regroup, but found themselves overwhelmed by well-coordinated assaults. Cities emptied in panic, highways clogged with civilians fleeing south, creating columns that stretched for miles. Trucks, cars, bicycles, ox carts, all crept forward at a snail's pace. Mothers clutched babies, men pushed carts loaded with rice and family heirlooms. Dust rose into the air like a storm. Reports flowed into Saigon. The enemy was closing in. Provinces once considered safe were falling in days instead of months. In Saigon, fear rippled through every neighborhood. Government officials burned documents. People lined up outside foreign embassies, desperate for visas. Some tried to sell possessions to gather enough money to bribe their way onto departing ships or planes. Radio broadcasts became increasingly frantic. Maps on television showed red arrows pointing south, inching closer and closer to the capital. On April 29, 1975, the final hours arrived. North Vietnamese tanks roared into the outskirts of Saigon. Gunfire rattled through neighborhoods once known for quiet cafes and bookstores. Embassies filled with panicked crowds begging for evacuation. Helicopters whirred overhead, ferrying people from rooftops to ships waiting offshore. At the U.S. Embassy, Marines held the perimeter, while staff destroyed sensitive documents. Evacuees were lifted out in helicopters as crowds surged against the gates. The air smelled of burning paper and exhaust fumes. In the streets, Vietnamese citizens wept, prayed, and tried to flee however they could. On April 30th, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. Soldiers leapt from hatches, carrying flags red with a yellow star. Inside, South Vietnamese President Duong Van Minh surrendered formally, asking for peace to spare the city further bloodshed. Saigon had fallen. The Vietnam War, as far as the world measured it, was over. But for the millions whose lives it had consumed, the war was not truly finished. When the red and gold flags rose over Saigon on April 30th, 1975, it marked the end of the Vietnam War for the world. But for the people who lived through it, the conflict did not simply stop because the last shots fell silent. All across Vietnam, change came swiftly and often brutally. In the days immediately after the fall of Saigon, the streets fell into a tense quiet. Soldiers from the victorious North moved through neighborhoods in neat columns, rifles slung over shoulders. Loudspeakers crackled with messages of liberation and unity, urging people to cooperate with the new government. In homes behind shuttered windows, families whispered urgently, debating what to do. Should they stay and hope for forgiveness, or flee the country while they still could? Many who had worked for the South Vietnamese government, the military, or American forces faced a grim fate. They were ordered to report for re-education, an innocuous-sounding term that often meant imprisonment, forced labor, and relentless political indoctrination. Men disappeared into camps, hidden deep in jungles or in old French colonial forts. There, days stretched endlessly under a sun that burned through bamboo leaves. Prisoners dug canals, chopped trees, broke rocks. Guards shouted slogans. Food was scarce. Illness swept through crowded barracks, where men slept on bare boards. Letters arrive from home, written in trembling script. The children are growing. We pray you come back soon. But months turned into years for many, with no clear end in sight. In the cities, the new government moved quickly to restructure society. Businesses were seized. Property was redistributed. Those labeled bourgeois found their shops and homes confiscated. Bank accounts vanished overnight. Markets grew quiet. Shelves stood empty. Fear spread like a chill through Saigon's humid streets. Neighbors who once shared coffee and laughter eyed each other warily, unsure who might inform on whom. People began to vanish at night. Businessmen, teachers, writers, doctors. Some were questioned and released, their eyes shadowed with new caution. Others were never seen again. Yet life had to continue. Women still woke before dawn to sweep the sidewalks. Vendors still boiled soup over charcoal braziers, filling alleyways with the scent of broth and star anise. Children played games in courtyards, although their laughter felt subdued. And amid all the uncertainty, thousands of families began planning to leave Vietnam by any means necessary. They sold family heirlooms, gold rings passed down through generations, jade bracelets worn by grandmothers, lacquer boxes painted with scenes of dragons and lotus flowers. They bribed officials, paid boat builders, and whispered plans in kitchens late at night. The exodus began slowly, then surged. Small wooden fishing boats set out under cover of darkness, overloaded with people huddled shoulder to shoulder. Engines sputtered, sails strained against tropical winds. Mothers clutched babies close, trying to soothe cries with gentle songs. Fathers stared into the Black Sea, scanning for patrol boats or pirates. Some boats never made it. Storms rose without warning, swallowing fragile vessels into monstrous waves. Pirates attacked, stealing what little the refugees carried, sometimes taking lives. For those who survived, weeks at sea were marked by hunger and thirst. Water turned brackish. Children fell ill. The sun scorched skin raw. Men wept silently, hiding their faces in trembling hands. Then, on distant horizons, ships appeared, merchant freighters, navy vessels from other nations. Crew members leaned over railings, astonished at the sight of ragged refugees, waving cloths and screaming for help. Rescue came in a rush of ropes thrown over rails, of gentle hands pulling emaciated figures from the sea. Refugees stepped onto foreign decks and collapsed, some kissing the steel floors in relief. Thousands were carried to refugee camps in places like Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, Hong Kong. Rows of tents stretched across muddy fields. Barbed wire ringed the perimeter. Aid workers distributed bowls of rice, packets of powdered milk, and clean water. Doctors treated skin infections, fevers, and malnutrition. Volunteers handed out toys to wide-eyed children who clutched them like precious treasures. Families waited weeks, months, sometimes years for new homes to be found in faraway countries. America, Canada, Australia, France. Interviews determined who would go where. Rumors swept the camps. Canada is cold. America has jobs. Australia has sunshine. At night, refugees gathered under lanterns, sharing stories of survival, trading news about loved ones left behind. Songs rose over the tents, soft, sad melodies, speaking of rivers, rice fields, and the pain of losing one's homeland. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, Vietnam veterans in America wrestled with their own ghosts. They stepped off planes into cities filled with bright lights and familiar streets, but nothing felt the same. For years, many kept their stories locked away, buried beneath jobs, families, and the routine of everyday life. They tried to blend back in, to become teachers, carpenters, factory workers, businessmen, but fragments of the jungle followed them home. A certain smell, rain on asphalt, burning leaves, could send their hearts pounding. Fireworks on the 4th of July became flashes of incoming mortar rounds. Nightmares gripped them in the dark, leaving sheets soaked in sweat. Some veterans found solace among each other. VFW halls became sanctuaries where they could speak without explaining. They shared beers, swapped stories, and nodded silently at shared memories. Others turned inward, unable to talk about what they'd seen. Marriages suffered. Children grew up sensing a wall they could not climb. Society often didn't know what to make of them. The nation was conflicted, ashamed of the war, guilty over how returning soldiers were treated. Some blamed veterans for atrocities. Others called them heroes. Many tried not to think about Vietnam at all. For some veterans, the first time they saw the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., was like standing in front of a mirror, reflecting their own pain back at them. The black granite wall stretched into the ground, polished so smoothly it caught the sky and the faces of those who came to visit. Names were etched there, over 58,000 of them, each one a person who never came home. People traced the letters with trembling fingers, pressing paper against stone to make rubbings to carry away. Visitors left flowers, letters, medals, teddy bears, boots. Some fell to their knees and wept. Others stood in silence, eyes glistening, caught between memory and grief. For many veterans, touching the wall was the first time they truly began to heal. Meanwhile, the Vietnamese who arrived in America began to rebuild lives from scratch. They moved into cities like Houston, Orange County, San Jose, New Orleans. They opened grocery stores selling fish sauce, jasmine rice, and fragrant herbs. Faux restaurants appeared on street corners, their windows fogged with steam. Children enrolled in schools, learning English and trying to navigate two worlds. At home, they spoke Vietnamese and listened to stories of ancestors and rivers winding through emerald fields. Outside, they became part of America, with jeans, sneakers, and new dreams. Vietnamese churches and temples sprang up, filled with incense smoke and the soft chants of prayers. Community centers held Tet festivals where dragon dancers leapt through crowds, while drums boomed like distant thunder. Yet for many immigrants, memories of home remained sharp. Old men gathered in cafes, drinking strong coffee from tiny cups, talking about Saigon, about lost friends, about the scent of flowering trees in narrow alleys. Women shared recipes, folding dumplings and remembering markets, overflowing with tropical fruits and bright cloth. For some, America became a land of opportunity. For others, it was a place of loneliness, haunted by the ghosts of the past. In Vietnam, the years after 1975 were marked by both rebuilding and hardship. The country was reunified under communist rule. Officially named the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, the new government set out to transform society, redistributing land, collectivizing agriculture, and attempting to reshape economic life in the mold of socialist ideals. In rural villages, government officials arrived to explain new policies. Loudspeakers announced quotas for rice production and instructions for collective farming. Families, who once worked small plots of land alone, were now expected to join cooperatives, pooling tools, labor, and harvests. Some farmers embraced the change, hoping it would bring fairness and security. Others resisted, suspicious of losing the small independence they'd managed to keep even during wartime. Meanwhile, cities struggled. The economy stumbled under the weight of sanctions, the loss of foreign trade, and decades of war damage. Factories sat idle, machinery rusted, shelves in stores stood empty. Bartering became common as currency lost value. In Saigon, now renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Streets once alive with French cafes and American bars took on a quieter, more austere air. Propaganda posters blossomed on walls, painted in bright reds and yellows, showing heroic workers, soldiers and farmers, marching under fluttering flags. Yet beneath the slogans, everyday life was difficult. Long lines formed outside stores for basic goods. Families rationed rice. Black markets flourished, selling everything from canned sardines to bicycle parts. People adapted. They mended old clothes, traded favors, learned how to stretch meals. A bar of soap became a precious commodity. A new pair of shoes was a luxury beyond imagining. Children still played in alleys, turning discarded tires into games, laughing in the rain that fell warm and sudden from monsoon skies. But adults carried worry in their eyes, scanning the streets for officials, listening for rumors of arrests. The government began a campaign called the New Economic Zones, urging urban residents to move to remote regions, to clear forests and farm new land. Families boarded trucks piled high with furniture, chickens and cooking pots. But many zones were harsh, with poor soil and little infrastructure. Malaria spread quickly. Water sources ran dry. Some families abandoned the zones and returned secretly to cities, trying to slip back into lives they had left behind. Vietnam was also drawn into a new conflict. In late 1978, tensions flared along the border with Cambodia, then ruled by the brutal Khmer Rouge. Vietnamese leaders, citing cross-border attacks and genocide inside Cambodia, launched an invasion that toppled the Khmer Rouge regime. This action plunged Vietnam into another protracted conflict, this time occupying Cambodia and facing guerrilla warfare from Khmer Rouge remnants supported by China. China, in turn, launched a brief but fierce invasion of northern Vietnam in 1979, punishing the country for its actions in Cambodia. Battles erupted along mountain passes and small towns. Villages burned once again. Fields lay trampled under tank treads. The people of Vietnam, already weary from decades of war, braced themselves for more hardship. Meanwhile, the Vietnamese diaspora continued to grow abroad. Communities flourished in places like Westminster, California, a stretch of city streets that would come to be known as Little Saigon. Vietnamese signs hung above restaurants, law offices, bakeries, and beauty salons. Grocery stores offered baskets overflowing with bitter melons, lemongrass, and stacks of rice noodles. Tet festivals blossomed in American cities, drawing thousands to watch dragon dances, taste festival foods, and share memories of the homeland. Vietnamese newspapers sprang up, reporting on both local news and events back home. Families navigated a delicate balance. Parents preserved old customs, language, respect for elders, traditional holidays, while children absorbed American culture at lightning speed. Some older immigrants never fully adapted, longing for the warm breezes of Saigon, the scent of roasted chestnuts on street corners, the golden light that fell across rice paddies at dusk. Others embraced new beginnings, sending their children to college, opening successful businesses, and creating bridges between two worlds. In American culture, the Vietnam War left deep scars. Filmmakers began telling stories of soldiers haunted by memories, of battles fought in steaming jungles, of moral confusion and loss. Movies like The Deer Hunter, Platoon, Apocalypse Now, and Full Metal Jacket became cultural touchstones. Some films focused on the chaos and brutality of combat. Others explored the psychic wounds carried home by veterans. The war became a canvas on which America painted its fears, guilt, and questions about power and morality. Musicians wrote ballads of protest and sorrow. Bruce Springsteen sang of veterans returning to small towns that felt foreign. Country singers spoke of patriotism and sacrifice. Punk bands screamed their anger into microphones. Writers filled shelves with memoirs, novels, and histories trying to make sense of what had happened. Some books offered raw, unflinching accounts of firefights and terror. Others examined the political calculations and missteps that led a superpower into an unwinnable war. The Vietnam War became a word loaded with emotion. For some, it meant courage and loyalty. For others, it meant tragedy and futility. For many, it remained a wound that never fully healed. Yet amid all the pain, life refused to vanish entirely. In Vietnam, families continued to gather for Tet. Even in the years of hardship and isolation, they cleaned houses, hung bright red banners inscribed with characters wishing for luck, prosperity, and health. Small altars flickered with candles as incense curled into the air. Grandmothers told children stories of the old days, of bustling markets in Saigon, of the Mekong River glistening under moonlight, of fireworks crackling above the roofs of Hanoi. In the north, people recalled the long years of war and hardship with a mix of pride and exhaustion. They spoke of carrying supplies along jungle paths, of villages burned and rebuilt, of neighbors who vanished and never returned. In the south, memories were tangled. Some still grieved for the Republic of Vietnam, mourning the soldiers and leaders who had fallen. Others tried to adapt, eager to leave the past behind. Life was full of contradictions. Propaganda blared from loudspeakers, praising the victory and the bright socialist future. Yet many people struggled to find enough rice for the next meal. Students studied revolutionary slogans in school, but secretly read foreign magazines passed hand to hand in alleyways. By the early 1980s, Vietnam began to feel the weight of its isolation. Trade was limited. The American embargo remained in place. Relations with China were tense, with skirmishes flaring on the northern border. Then, in 1986, a new word appeared on the lips of Vietnamese leaders. It meant renovation. The government announced sweeping reforms, allowing private businesses, loosening state controls, and inviting foreign investment. Slowly, the grip of rigid socialism began to loosen. Small shops reopened. Entrepreneurs reappeared, selling goods in colorful market stalls. Bicycles gave way to motorbikes buzzing through city streets. Neon signs flickered on in Ho Chi Minh City. Cafes filled with laughter and conversation. Vietnamese music blended traditional instruments with modern pop beats. Fashion evolved, mixing the elegance of eau dye with Western styles. Foreign tourists, long absent, began to trickle back. At first, the changes were cautious, but over time, Midi transformed the country. Farmers could sell surplus crops in free markets. Factory owners hired workers and chased export contracts. Universities expanded curricula to include business and technology. Young people learned English, eager to connect with a broader world. Cities pulsed with energy. Skyscrapers rose above old French colonial buildings. Rooftop bars offered sweeping views of rivers winding through glittering urban lights. In markets, vendors called out prices for dragon fruit, durian, shrimp, and jasmine rice. Tailors stitched suits and dresses for customers eager to show off new fashions. Musicians performed love songs in coffee shops, lit by warm lanterns. Yet shadows of the past lingered. In rural villages, elders still spoke of family members lost during land reforms, of nights spent listening to artillery fire. In cities, older generations recalled days when friends vanished into prison camps. Remnants of war lay buried beneath fields. Unexploded ordnance, rusted weapons, sunken tanks. Farmers still uncovered bombs while plowing soil. Children were taught not to touch strange metal objects, half buried in grass. Meanwhile, in America, the Vietnam War slowly shifted from a fresh wound to a haunting memory. Through the 1980s and 90s, veterans began speaking more openly. Support groups formed to help those struggling with nightmares, anxiety, and guilt. The term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, entered everyday language, offering a name for invisible wounds. Television programs interviewed veterans who described what it was like to return home to a country divided, to walk through airports feeling unseen, to lie awake at night replaying the sounds of war. Some veterans went back to Vietnam. Decades after the fighting stopped, they walked through former battlefields, now covered in dense jungle. They visited towns where children stared curiously at the tall strangers with cameras and sun hats. Some veterans searched for places where friends had died, placing small memorials of flowers or stones. Others tried to find peace by seeing how Vietnam had changed. The laughter of school children, the vibrant markets, the kindness of people who offered tea and smiles despite the past. In both Vietnam and America, bridges began to form. Vietnamese entrepreneurs connected with overseas Vietnamese who returned to invest. New businesses opened factories, tech firms, restaurants. In little Saigons across America, younger generations began to feel curiosity rather than only pain. They traveled back to Vietnam to explore the land their parents once fled. They visited ancestral villages, met distant relatives, and learned the rhythms of Vietnamese language and culture. Artists and filmmakers, both Vietnamese and American, collaborated on projects exploring identity, memory, and reconciliation. Music blended Vietnamese melodies with hip-hop, R&B, and pop. High school students in America interviewed their Vietnamese grandparents for history class projects, capturing tales of rice paddies, refugee boats, and rebuilding lives from scratch. In Vietnam, museums began to present the war not only as a victory, but as a tragedy that cost countless lives on all sides. Stories of common soldiers, of women who carried rice through jungles, of families caught between armies, started to be told alongside tales of battlefield triumphs. And yet, wounds remained. For older Vietnamese immigrants, the fall of Saigon was not simply a historical event, but the day their world ended. Some kept portraits of the old South Vietnamese flag in their homes, hidden or displayed, depending on where they lived. Debates flared in community gatherings over how to remember the past, how to speak of the war, how to forgive, or whether forgiveness was even possible. Among American veterans, some still struggled to speak of Vietnam. Others dedicated themselves to ensuring the nation would never forget the price of war. Across both countries, people wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Was the war justified? Could it have ended differently? Who was responsible for so much suffering? Yet alongside those questions grew something quieter. A desire to heal, to remember without hatred, to honor the dead by building something better for the living. In the early 2000s, Vietnam stood at a crossroads, eager to join the global community. Trade agreements opened new markets. Tourists arrived in growing numbers, drawn by tales of emerald rice paddies, historic temples and limestone islands rising from tranquil seas. In Ho Chi Minh City, the streets became a river of motorbikes, headlights glittering like stars. New coffee shops opened every month, serving cappuccinos, alongside traditional Vietnamese drip coffee sweetened with condensed milk. Young Vietnamese embraced the internet, pop music and fashion trends from Seoul and Tokyo. But they also honored traditions, gathering at family altars, wearing áo dai on special occasions, and cleaning ancestors' graves during festivals. Yet even in this modern rush, the echoes of the war were never far away. Veterans from America, Australia, South Korea, and other nations returned to Vietnam as visitors. They arrived carrying suitcases, photographs, and memories folded like old letters in their hearts. Some stood silently at places like Khe San, Hamburger Hill, or the Cu Chi tunnels, trying to reconcile lush green landscapes with memories of fire and fear. Vietnamese guides led them through battlefields, speaking gently about the past. Sometimes they paused in front of memorials, offering moments of silence for fallen soldiers, regardless of uniform or flag. These journeys were often bittersweet. Veterans met former enemies, now old men with silver hair, shaking hands over cups of tea. They shared stories through translators, discovering a shared humanity forged by suffering neither side had wished for. For many veterans, these trips offered a step toward peace. They carried home new images of Vietnam. Markets bursting with color, schoolchildren waving from bicycles, monks chanting in incense-filled temples. They realized Vietnam was not only the place of their nightmares, but also a country filled with people who had endured, survived, and rebuilt. Meanwhile, in Vietnamese American communities, younger generations felt a mixture of curiosity and distance toward the war that had shaped their parents' lives. Some learned Vietnamese to speak to grandparents. Others traveled to Vietnam, fascinated by the streets their families once called home. They posted photos online of lanterns glowing in Hump's steaming bowls of pho, of the emerald waters of Hump's Long Bay. Yet conversations with elders often revealed wounds still unhealed. Tears sometimes welled up in older eyes when speaking of April 30th, 1975, of friends left behind, of ships and planes that departed without them. In American classrooms, teachers struggled to explain the Vietnam War. Textbooks condensed decades into a few pages. Domino theory, the Gulf of Tonkin, Tet, Vietnamization, the fall of Saigon. Students often looked puzzled, wondering why the war had lasted so long, why so many had died, and how a superpower could leave in defeat. But, for those who had lived through it, the Vietnam War could never be reduced to dates and battles. It was a million small memories, the sound of helicopters chopping low over the treetops, the taste of rain on canvas tents, the muddy smell of rice paddies at dawn. A mother sits cry as soldiers searched her home, letters stained with sweat, dirt, and tears, the rustling whisper of jungle leaves hiding both friend and foe. In Vietnam, museums display tanks, jet fighters, and battered uniforms. Tourists photograph captured American helicopters and rusting artillery pieces. Guides tell visitors about American strategies, about tunnels and guerrilla tactics, but they also share stories of children who carried messages through enemy lines, of farmers caught between armies, of families who simply tried to survive. In old French buildings now repurposed as museums, black and white photos show soldiers wading through chest-deep water, faces tense with exhaustion. Other photos show children fleeing napalm strikes, villages in flames, refugees trudging along dusty roads. The images speak without words, bridging decades and continents. Among the older Vietnamese generations, memories of the war remain intertwined with the simplest moments of daily life. An elderly man slicing papaya for breakfast pauses, staring out the window as sunlight flickers through palm leaves. He remembers standing watch on a moonlit trail, clutching a rifle, listening for the distant rumble of American bombers. A woman kneeling in a temple whispers prayers for a brother who disappeared in 1973, his name never officially listed among the dead. She lays incense sticks in a bronze urn, the smoke curling skyward like silent questions. In marketplaces across Vietnam, veterans of the war sometimes gather, leaning over tables where checkers pieces slide across wooden boards. They talk softly about rising food prices, grandchildren's weddings, and the cost of medicine. But occasionally, a phrase slips through a battalion number, the name of a long-ago outpost, the faint regret in someone's eyes. Meanwhile, in American towns, veterans grow older. They attend reunions, wearing jackets adorned with patches and medals. They share stories that grow softer over the years, no longer shouted but spoken quietly, as if handling fragile glass. Some bring scrapbooks filled with photos of grinning young soldiers posing beside helicopters, of mess halls decked with Christmas lights, of letters marked free mail. They laugh about the absurdities, the geckos dropping onto bunk beds, the dust that coated everything during dry season, the strange taste of sea rations heated over small fires. Yet their eyes turn solemn when they speak of ambushes, of friends lost in firefights, of helicopter rides heavy with the wounded. For many, the war is like a book half closed, its pages dog-eared and smudged. Among the Vietnamese diaspora, younger generations continue bridging worlds. They produce YouTube channels dedicated to Vietnamese cooking, weaving stories of grandmothers making bánh xèo on sizzling griddles. They share old photographs on social media, asking followers to help identify faces frozen in sepia tones. Poets write about refugee camps, of salt-stung winds on crowded boats, of the taste of freedom mixed with sorrow. Musicians create songs blending traditional, An melodies with modern beats. Yet all of them, whether in Vietnam or abroad, carry the weight of questions that have no perfect answers. Could the war have been avoided? Was all the suffering in vain? Did anyone truly win? Among American historians, debates continue. Some argue the war was doomed from the start, a misunderstanding of Vietnamese history and culture. Others insist different choices might have led to peace. Books are written and rewritten. Professors lecture in crowded halls. Documentaries trace the same battles from new angles. Yet despite all the analysis, the true heart of the Vietnam War remains in the lived experience of those who survived it, in the smell of rain falling on red clay soil, in the rhythm of helicopter blades chopping through tropical skies, in the whispered Vietnamese lullabies sung to children half a world away. In modern Vietnam, reminders of the past and visions of the future sit side by side. A teenager in Hanoi swipes through a smartphone, checking messages and pop music videos. Outside, her grandmother sits in the courtyard, trimming herbs, her fingers stained green, humming an old revolutionary song. In Ho Chi Minh City, glass towers rise above colonial-era buildings painted ochre and white. Rooftop bars glow with neon lights while motorbikes roar below, weaving like schools of fish through the crowded streets. Vendors call out prices for durian, mangosteens, and rambutans, their voices competing with the hum of engines and the clang of passing trams. Tourists flock to famous sites, the Cu Chi tunnels, the War Remnants Museum, the grand boulevards laid down by French colonial planners. They snap photos beside tanks and helicopters captured during the war, marveling at how the jungle has reclaimed old battlefields. Some leave small offerings at temples, praying for peace, or in memory of relatives whose fates were never known. For older Vietnamese, the presence of foreigners walking through these places is sometimes bittersweet. Some feel pride that their country has survived and grown strong. Others feel a deep ache for the lives and possibilities lost along the way. In quiet villages, elders gather beneath trees, drinking green tea from small cups, discussing harvests and grandchildren. Occasionally, the conversation drifts back to wartime years, the price of rice during bombing campaigns, the fear of patrols, the nights spent listening to distant artillery. They speak of friends who left on boats and never returned, of letters arriving from America written in careful Vietnamese, telling of new lives, new cities, and new freedoms, and of longing for familiar rivers and mountain ranges. Among American veterans who return to visit, many find themselves overwhelmed by the warmth of the people they once called enemies. In small towns, Vietnamese families invite them into homes. They share meals of rice, grilled fish, and pickled vegetables. They pour cups of tea and ask gentle questions. When were you here? Which province? Do you remember? Some veterans break down in tears, moved by forgiveness they never thought possible. They try to explain how they carried guilt for years, how they wondered if they'd ever be welcome again. Vietnamese hosts listen, nodding, sometimes offering their own memories of hardship and loss. For both sides, these meetings are healing in ways no treaty could ever accomplish. Meanwhile, younger generations of Vietnamese Americans grow increasingly curious about their roots. They travel to Vietnam for the first time, stepping off planes into hot, humid air that smells of diesel fumes and flowering trees. They visit the streets their parents described, the same alleys, temples, markets. Some stand before family homes, tracing the outlines of doorways, imagining childhood stolen by war. They post videos on social media, documenting every moment. This is where my mom used to go to school. My dad says he remembers the old market that used to be right here. I finally tried real pho in Saigon. It tastes different from home. Their parents watch these videos with mixed emotions. Pride, nostalgia, sometimes pain. For them, the Vietnam of memory remains layered with sorrow. While their children see beauty and possibility, these journeys reconnect families separated for decades. Long-lost cousins embrace. Grandparents cry softly, clutching the hands of grandchildren born in faraway lands. In the markets of Vietnam, vendors greet returning overseas Vietnamese with warmth, and sometimes a wry smile when realizing their customers struggle with Vietnamese words. Deals are made in a blend of English, Vietnamese and gestures. In temples, incense coils burn slowly, carrying prayers skyward. Monks chant softly while sunlight filters through colored glass. Families kneel together, offering thanks for survival and hopes for the future. In the 21st century, Vietnam has stepped into a new chapter of its long, turbulent story. Cities like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City hum with relentless energy. Skyscrapers pierce skies once filled with the drone of helicopters. Streets glow with neon lights, advertising bubble tea, Korean cosmetics, and technology brands from around the world. Beneath towering modern buildings, the ancient rhythms remain. In dawn's soft light, elders gather in parks to practice Tai Chi, their slow, deliberate movements weaving shapes in the morning air. The fragrance of coffee drifts from sidewalk stalls, mingling with the sound of bicycle bells and the laughter of children on their way to school. Vietnam's economy surges forward, fueled by textiles, electronics, tourism, and a restless entrepreneurial spirit. Internet cafes, once filled with rows of young people gaming for hours, now host business meetings and freelancers. Students study English, Mandarin, Korean, eager to find their place in an interconnected world. Yet the past is never far away. Old bunkers lie hidden beneath vines in quiet fields. Farmers still unearth rusted artillery shells and fragments of shrapnel. Entire teams work tirelessly to clear unexploded ordnance from the soil, ensuring that rice paddies can safely yield harvests rather than tragedy. In small museums, uniforms stand on mannequins behind glass. Posters show stylized images of soldiers carrying rifles and flags. Photographs capture faces caught between fear and defiance, frozen in the black and white of history. Yet outside those museum walls, life goes on, pulsing with color and possibility. Along the Mekong River, women in conical hats paddle wooden boats heavy with coconuts, mangoes, and jackfruit. Tourists lean over the sides, marveling at the endless water channels winding through green palms. In Heian, lanterns glow in soft reds, yellows, and blues, swaying above cobblestone streets. Shops offer tailor-made suits sewn in a day. Couples pose for wedding photos beneath paper lanterns reflecting off quiet canals. In the old capital of Hue, the perfume river flows past citadel walls, scarred by past battles. Tourists climb ancient ramparts, hearing echoes of cannon fire and imperial processions. Yet today, Hue is also filled with cafes, students on bicycles, and monks in saffron robes crossing stone bridges. Vietnam's people have become experts at weaving past and present into a single fabric. In homes across the country, altars hold photographs of ancestors, faces faded by time but never forgotten. Candles burn during holidays, casting gentle light over bowls of fruit, plates of sweets, and cups of tea set out for spirits of the departed. Younger Vietnamese listen with quiet respect as elders speak of years of struggle, of courage, of sacrifice. Yet they also look toward the future, driven by dreams of careers, education, and travel. In the quiet hours of the night, the memories of the Vietnam War still ripple beneath the surface of modern life. For veterans on both sides, time has softened some of the sharp edges, yet certain moments remain vivid as yesterday. A rustle in tall grass might still echo like a patrol creeping through darkness. The smell of rain on hot pavement can transport a man back to muddy trails where leeches clung to skin and unseen eyes watched from the shadows. Some American veterans have found peace returning to Vietnam, walking streets that once trembled under gunfire, finding laughter and kindness where they once found fear. They sit in small cafes, sipping strong black coffee sweetened with condensed milk, marveling at how life continues to grow from the same soil once soaked with blood. For many Vietnamese who fled decades ago, the land they left behind exists in two worlds: the real Vietnam of today and the Vietnam that lives in memory. In communities across America, Australia, France, and Canada, the scent of pho simmering in giant pots fills community centers during Tet. Children perform dances in bright costumes. Elders wipe away tears, smiling even as their voices catch when they speak of home. Conversations drift between languages. English merges with Vietnamese, creating a melody of cultures intertwined. Young people ask questions about the war, about escape, about a homeland they're only beginning to know. In Vietnam, life surges forward. Skyscrapers rise where rice paddies once lay. Digital screens flash news and advertisements in bright neon. Streets buzz with motorbikes carrying office workers, school children, and vendors balancing baskets of fruit. But in quiet corners, memories remain. A fisherman on the Mekong remembers years spent hiding supplies for soldiers moving along hidden trails. A woman tending orchids on a balcony remembers standing in Saigon streets, watching helicopters lift the last Americans away. Historians continue to debate the war, dissecting battles, decisions, and strategies. But for those who lived it, the true war lies in the fragments: a face glimpsed in the jungle, never seen again; a village burning beneath a sky that once promised rain; the silence after a firefight, when even the birds forget to sing. The Vietnam War shaped nations and generations. It reshaped politics, art, music, and history. But more than anything, it shaped the human heart, teaching both cruelty and compassion, loss and survival. Tonight, as stars shine above Vietnam's rivers and cities, as neon lights blink over busy boulevards, as incense curls around altars where names are spoken softly into the dark, the story of the Vietnam War breathes on. It lives in whispered prayers, in old photographs, in the rustle of palm leaves swaying over fields where battles once raged. And in these memories, bitter and beautiful, the world finds not only sorrow, but also the quiet resilience that has always carried humanity forward. Thank you for sharing this long journey through history with me tonight. May your dreams be gentle, may your sleep be deep, and may the echoes of the past remind us all of the value of peace.